Today's show is a conversation I had with returning guest Peter Mark Adams. Peter is an author, poet, esotericist, and professional energy worker specializing in the ethnography and visuality of ritual and sacred places. He is certainly a friend of the show, and I know many of you really enjoy his work and his prolific research projects. I know I certainly do. He is the author of several works published by Scarlet Imprint, including Mysti, Dancing Out the Mysteries of Dionysus, The Game of Saturn, Decoding the Solobos Kataroki, and his latest work, which we discuss on the show today, Hagia Sophia, Sanctum of Kronos, Spiritual Descent in an Age of Tyranny. Hagia Sophia is a truly incredible sacred place, a sanctuary whose construction was begun in the year 532 AD, and once it was completed, it spent over 1,000 years as the largest cathedral in the world. It was built by incredible master architects who were most likely associated with the late Hellenic pagan philosopher Ammonius of Alexandria and his school. Peter's book brings together an incredible number of threads linking the imagery and structure of this building to theurgy, the ancient mystery cults of Greece, and the survivals of late Hellenic paganism into the very publicly Christian rule of Emperor Justinian and beyond. This podcast is at its heart about divination, and divination relies on symbolism and our ability to co-create and recognize and live within an unfolding sacred evocative world. Symbols are, at their heart, animistic, and what we build and what we create, what we worship in, and how we view those symbols are very much a part of what information we take in and what information the spirits can get through to us. There are so many interesting points that Peter makes in this book and that we were able to discuss, even just in brief, in this conversation. I hope you enjoy it. And if you do enjoy the podcast, I hope that you will subscribe to it and give us a 5-star review and share it with other people that you think would find it interesting. For now, thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoy.
Welcome to Coffee and Divination, a podcast about the arts of obtaining hidden knowledge in changing times. Join me, Joanna Farrar, to chat with experts from around the world on tarot, runes, geomancy, and the many ways divination can help us navigate and plan our paths ahead.
So thank you, Peter, so much for joining me here again. It is a huge pleasure to have you back on the show. It's always a favorite time when I get to speak to you about a new work. So I'm so glad you have this beautiful work out to the world. And so to start us off, I know that this is the tome that you've produced is a massive work, and it's incredibly deep with what we're going to go into. But if you were to give the cocktail party length introduction to someone about what this is, could you just give us that cocktail party intro?
Yeah, I'd summarize it, I guess. First of all, thanks for having me back. I'm always delighted to talk with you. If I had to summarize the project, I would say in a sense that it's the birth of the Western esoteric tradition, in the sense that it's at that watershed when the old mystery sanctuaries were freshly shut down and the lineage-holding priesthoods transferred or transposed their knowledge and skill to an urban environment. Okay, so that's like a major shift that took place at the end of the 4th century, because the sanctuaries were in essence a kind of sacred, or part of a sacred landscape, and the priests and priestesses who served in them did so on the basis of lineages that the deities themselves had passed on through their family lines. And then all of a sudden, towards the end of the 4th century, they were all closed down and their practices were forbidden. But of course, there's no way in which they could just drop everything. You know, these were like God-given lineages and initiatory lineages that they carried. So there was a transposition of that cult apparatus to an urban environment. And with that, you then had to develop a developmental program for the people who came to you, because it was no longer the case that people could freely visit the sanctuary every year or at Samothrace throughout the sailing season, have the initiations. and the priesthood carried the, so to speak, the sacred information. But now they had to find a new way of transmitting this current forward. And so we see the book is really about how that took place, the birth of this recognizable Western esoteric tradition, and how it fought to survive in the face of really intense repression from the Christian emperors Theodorus and then Justinian especially. So it's really quite pivotal period in terms of our belief system.
Yes, and I found the history in this book for myself personally was just absolutely fascinating and filled in so much that I think has been sorely lacking in our insights about what happened. Because I think, I mean, even modern neo-pagans, pagans like myself, we've always sort of like there's this idea that when the mystery sites like Eleusis and those places were closed, there's this, and that was the line in the sand. What happened after? I don't know. They died. And then there is sort of like this gap left until we see, and then I suppose the grimoires survived in Arabic forms and they were sort of hidden away somewhere. Right. But there's that initial period has been ignored. You sort of get like the history up to there, and then you get the history as the grimoires are entering Europe. But that gap has not been very clear. You point out we could go many different directions from that right away, but one of the key figures, which I'm so glad you've brought attention to because I find her fascinating, is Asclepiadina. And if you could just tell us who she was and why she's important to this story.
Yeah. So the Sanctuary of Eleusis, which was perhaps the most prominent of the great initiatory sites of the ancient world, and had been for maybe 1,000 years, faced with the suppression and the closing down at the end of the 4th century, the last legitimate Hierophant, Nestorius, who, as I say, had this initiatory lineage in the Eumolpidae family. And we see this being granted in the hymn to Demeter, Homeric hymn to Demeter from like 7th or 8th century BCE. So this is like 1,000 years later. And Nestorius had a son, Plutarch of Athens, who was a priest of Asclepius. And these were wealthy individuals, it has to be. They were very prominent in Athenian society. Plutarch of Athens had a daughter, Asclepiadina. And faced with the end of the Sanctuary of Eleusis and the decision taken to transpose its rites to Athens, they took a decision to train Asclepiadina in the initiatory tradition of Eleusis, so that she was granted the right and the capability to transmit the Eleusinian initiation, which is absolutely amazing thing. It didn't die. She carried that almost for the whole of the succeeding century until something like 485 when she died. So pretty well trained probably in early teens. She was also trained in the practice of theurgy. And then when they transposed the rites of Eleusis to an urban environment, they had these villas in Athens, which you can still visit today. They're still there. They set up what is often called the Platonic Academy of Athens, but of course it wasn't a Platonic academy. Athens was densely an educational establishment city at that period. So there were any number of philosophical and other schools available. So rather than call it the Platonic Academy of Athens, which it has this title for some reason, it was actually a situated version of Eleusis within an urban environment in which Asclepiadina continued to convey the initiation of Eleusis and training in theurgy for the next 80 odd years that she lived there. Okay. And really her name has kind of vanished from the annals of the esoteric history. And yet without her commitment and dedication for the entirety of her life, this entire period would have been devoid of the tradition of the mysteries.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think both you and I share a love of and I'm so glad that this, from a scholarly perspective, has gotten more attention. The roles of priestesses in Greece and even in Rome, like the roles of women being more complex than maybe we were initially on the surface led to believe in the modern day. And so that's yet another piece of that fascinating puzzle.
So this period of history, though, this fourth to all the 5th century, when this school of Athens, this Platonic Academy of Athens, has so many designations, or the Neoplatonic movement in Athens, you have all of these scholarly labels stuck on top of it, which kind of obscure that, in fact, it was a continuation of Eleusis. That's the important point. It was an initiatory training establishment. And as such, it attracted some of the finest intellects of the ancient world. So just to try to clarify the types of people who went there, normally they had completed all the formal education then available, trivium, quadrivium. They had gone on to specialize in some professional activity, which could be engineering or as doctors, as lawyers. And on top of that, they had completed a study of Aristotle. Okay, so this is the caliber of individual that were accepted into the school, but they were not there to study. Okay, these people were well educated by any standard, even by today's standard.
Oh, I'm sure.
They were there to learn how to practice theurgy and to learn how to promulgate the spiritual system when they returned back to their native cities, many of which were in Asia Minor, in Alexandria, North Africa. So you have like people like Proclus, who was one of the commanding intellects of the age, actually. And he stayed on in the school and became the head of it. And so his tenure as head of the school and Asclepigenea's tenure as the initiatrix, in essence, the high priestess of, and conservator of the Eleusinian initiatory lineage, paralleled each other. And yet she has kind of disappeared from sight. And the fact that the majority of Proclus's effort in this 80-year period was devoted to devotions and theurgy and not to the study of Plato, even though he was a great exegete. He was not there to study Plato, and nor were his students, in essence.
So to kind of to build on that, when we're talking about that, like you were saying, the two of them, Proclus has been the one that's, knowledge has survived of and been focused on. And of course, in the modern day, we still, thankfully, are very aware to some degree of the importance of Plato and study Plato. Myself, even, at Juilliard, we were expected to have some knowledge of classical authors and Platonic thought and things like that. But it's very much focused on a very, it's philosophy, which is about ways of thinking, in a sense, and it's not really ever positioned in a situation of something that is practically applied. And as you're pointing out, that was in some sense the Asclepigenea perhaps piece. That's that lived and initiatory tradition of things. So you have the discussion about it, you have discourse around it, which is very much a part of it. But then there's also lived experience, and that's the part that is sort of not been talked about or been forgotten, whether intentionally or not. Is that kind of fair to say?
I mean, generations of classical scholars who've dealt with what, Neoplatonism, this scholarly concept from the 19th century, have disparaged theurgy. I mean, they call it like the last refuge of a despairing intelligentsia. They're so removed from spiritual practice themselves as academics that they can only read Plato as academics, and they can only see it in context as a forcing school for the text that they're interested in. Okay. To clarify on this, although Proclus was a great exegete, the kind of exegesis he provides is spiritual. And that's not the way, as you know, that Plato is read today. Okay, so especially in the Anglo-American sphere, we have a very kind of hard-nosed philosophical approach, which is based on analytic philosophy, which is resting on top of empiricism. Of course, in the continent, they have a different approach to Plato. It's far more poetic, metaphorical, and literary. Okay, so how Plato appears to different people depends a lot on which schools they were in. But when you go back to the text, you find that, for instance, Iamblichus had put together a seven-step developmental program for this type of school. Okay, and Iamblichus himself, as far as we know, was probably holding an initiatory lineage. He's well known as a proponent of theurgy. And he seems to have influenced the school in Athens to the extent that they've adapted his seven-step developmental program as the fundamental way to develop yourself towards achieving henosis or union with the divine. So that's what the seven steps were designed to achieve. They were not designed to reduce Platonic scholars. Okay, so it's important to see that. Okay, so in each of those seven steps, Iamblichus had identified a Platonic dialogue that would be supportive of the ideas they were trying to convey. But the developmental program itself was practical. Okay, it required that you master certain skills.
And you tie that in the book back to the ideas of, when we think about mystery traditions and this idea of going to Eleusis, of course, it was an experience we can't obviously describe, but there were also stages of preparation for that. And you point out that this ladder of virtues, these stages of preparation, that these schools having to move things into completely new forms may have been, in some sense, seeing that as part of that purification. So the purification has maybe changed form a little bit because now it's having to be done in a different way, but it's still part of that, what was originally in the Eleusinian Mysteries and other mystery cults, very important, which is that purification of miasma, that preparation of the self, before you could just wander on, take part in the procession to go to the mystery.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, the preparations for Eleusis were extensive. It was kind of a year-long process. Of course, in some of the Dionysian cults, they were far more immediate, but still there had to be a process of preparing not just yourself, all the clothing and items. I mean, and in that sense, you had to manufacture them. It wasn't as though you could buy them. These ritual items were so special. And on top of that, we need to distinguish the two elements of the mysteries again, because the first stage was a purificatory ritual, myesis, okay? And 90% of the people took that and stopped there. Okay, so they had undertaken the mysteries, but they hadn't completed them. And the reason for that is the second step, which is the actual entering into the presence of the deities, was awe-inspiring. And so it only really attracted the most dedicated and pioneer-like spirits, and Proclus makes this point many times that, prior to the arrival of the deity, there's a stream of otherworldly entities rushing through the ritual space, and some people are frankly terrified. So, you have this pyramid of people engaging with the mysteries. First of all, they're a minority immediately. Even amongst the devotees of a cult, only 30-40% of them were actually initiated. And of that 30 or 40%, probably 70-80% of them didn't complete the full initiation. I mean, the cleansing and purification, especially of ancestral miasma or pollution of some kind, was quite enough, thank you, for this lifetime.
Yes.
And so to try and transpose this kind of cult apparatus to an urban environment required a far more developmental program.
Yeah.
You know, you couldn't launch people in the same way, because coming to Eleusis, you were part of a huge procession that left Athens and walked there. And as you walked there, I mean, the whole thing was saturated with ritual, dance, song, paying obeisances to the various, you know, it was impactful ceremony. And of course, set in a sacred landscape, that was integral part of the experience. And all of that was lost. So, you know, they really had to re-engineer an approach to enlightenment, given the end goal, which is Genesis. Okay, they're setting out to bring people into the presence of the deity and into union with the deity. So the technology had to be adapted to that. That's a formidable challenge.
Absolutely. And so I think some people listening may be wondering, well, we're talking a lot about Eleusis. We're not really talking about the building that this book is about, but it is very much about that and that transposition of the two.
Yeah.
And it's interesting to me, of course, like your previous book, or one of your previous books on the Dionysian mystery cults and the villa at Pompeii, which we've already spoken about in another interview. If you're listening and you haven't listened to that interview, I highly recommend you go back and listen to it, because it's fascinating. Of course, I would think that about my own show, but it's but in this sense, you've written two books that are about that translation, right, of mysteries into another form that takes very much an awareness of space into context. That it is that the building of this structure was all about in some sense, was an attempt to be able to bring that numinous and that experience of the numinous into a physicalized form in a sacred way, so that people could experience it in another way, since the rites of Eleusis and other mystery cults had closed.
Yeah.
With that being said, in order to do that, in both books you talk about the use of symbols and symbola and symbol. I'm going to mispronounce them. Symptomata. Thank you. Could you explain to us those words and why they are so important when we set out to understand the structure of this building and what it is bringing people to an awareness of?
Okay, so what I did in the book is to identify a few elements of what we could describe as the visual culture of this Hellenistic world. And it like pivots around a few key concepts. One of them is the fact that the belief that the imprint of the creator, or of the creation, is to be found or seen in all matter. Okay, this is a very much a soul-imbued view of reality. Okay, and that's the problem for us today, of course, is that we've moved so far away from that. But if everything is imbued with soul, and the Plato's Timaeus is probably the best example of a description of this process by which soul was proportionally distributed throughout reality. And given that, then even the stones are, so to speak, imbued with a certain force, which is natural to them. And that force, they describe that as symptomata. It's the intrinsic soul-like aliveness of objects themselves. And then when you assemble closely related or symbolically related items together as an assemblage, you have what's called symbola. And then this is very much as the modern ritualist would bring together certain scents and certain plants and certain colors and so on for a specific objective. That is an exercise in symbola, bringing together related items to enhance a certain kind of energy or quality of energy. So the imbuing of all matter with soul, the natural alignment of matter with certain objects, and thirdly, the assemblage of these objects as an accelerator or amplifier of their natural force. And this extends to light and sound as well. Okay, so enargia is that quality of conspicuous presence, which is light. Okay, and if we're going to talk about sound a little, there's a huge subdiscipline here, which is the Pythagorean approach or understanding of acoustics. Okay, so I mean, maybe we'll come on to that.
Oh,
because it's
I have
big time in this building. Okay,
Yes,
so
yes.
this is the visual culture, the essential aliveness of the matter and its assemblage to act as an amplifier for those spiritual forces. This is absolutely fundamental to understanding an edifice like Hagia Sophia.
Mm-hmm. I think that now, with that underpinning our discussion, can you tell us a little bit, just to give people context, of who built this? It was commissioned by Justinian, who was most definitely not a proponent of Hellenistic paganism, but the builders are very fascinating. Can you just tell us a little bit about the building of it?
Yeah. What triggered this? I mean, I live kind of in fairly close proximity to the building, so I've always had this sense about it. But it was an essay by Anthony Caldelis in which he talks about the intellectual and spiritual milieu of the designers. And it turns out that they were students of Eutychius of Alexandria, who was a student of Ammonius. And these two, Ammonius was Proclus's prime student, greatest student. So you have like a lineage, Nestorius to Plutarch, from Plutarch to Syrianus, and then Proclus and Asclepius running the school. And Ammonius, trained personally by Proclus, returning to Alexandria and teaching at the pagan school in Alexandria of Hor Apollo, is run by an Egyptian family who themselves seem to have been initiates of the cult of Isis. Okay, so he was teaching this spiritual program there, and his successor was Eutychius. They're both renowned mathematicians and geometers. So there's a spiritual tradition in the maths and geometry. Proclus always said, when you need to reorientate your soul to the absolute, mathematics and geometry is one of the most direct ways of doing so, one of the purest ways. So the maths and geometry were inextricably bound with the spiritual approach emanating from the school of Eleusis. Again, it's found a more intellectual mode of transition, which it didn't need to, of course, at the mystery side. Priesthoods, everything was all functioning there. Now it started to become more articulated. So for the professionals in the ancient world, there were like 3 grades, and for our purposes, the lower grade would be like a master builder. And then above them, with a higher education, would be a professional, what we probably think of as a professional architect. And above them, again, a very small number of people were called mechanicoi. And that meant that they had the highest qualifications, experience, and knowledge. And on top of that, they were embarked on mathematical and scientific research, pure research. So they were only called upon when the engineering problems were of a sufficient complexity and required a certain innovation or so on. So the 2 designers of the building were mechanicoi, and they were students of Eutychius and possibly of Ammonius. So they were linked into a pedagogical tradition that was intrinsically metaphysical, spiritual, and what can you say about them? These were the commanding intellects of the age, and they were called upon by Justinian to create this building. And now, what people don't appreciate is that Byzantine society and culture was riven in two, and remains so right until the end, because essentially you have a professional class who are steeped in Hellenistic literature and values, and you have this new ruling elite through Theodorus and Justinian's uncle and himself, who had, well, Justinian's uncle was illiterate. He was a swineherd. So there wasn't a question, you know. Justinian had had a theological education. So for him, the entire Hellenistic world was an alien culture in many ways. So although they wanted to stamp a uniform Christianity on this culture, they still relied upon the professionals to run the empire, to engineer its buildings and its aqueducts, to control the army, to do the supply chain. Everything rested on a professional elite who were thoroughly steeped in Hellenistic values, and
that continued,
and it remained problematic right through to the end. And people may recall the figure of Platon in the game of Saturn, who actually transposed the theurgic rites to the Italian elite in the 15th century. Again, he was a court insider, and it died in the Hellenist through and through. And yet, you know, there we go. This is after how many hundreds of years of Christianity. So this was kind of an ineradicable presence within the Eastern Empire.
And you make the point, I think it is really important to situate what you are talking about and what you're uncovering about this building within the context of the fact that the builders themselves, this Hellenistic, well-educated elite, and obviously all of the people at that time were living under a tyrant. Justinian was a tyrant who was quite brutal in his reign, and I think that is one of the keys to understanding why some of these symbols and this meaning could be there. As you were saying, he did not come from that tradition, and therefore maybe would not have been so likely to see it, but also that allowed for some dissent to still continue, which always happens. It always comes up in every culture around the world when there's that kind of thing. But I think that's important to situate why it's so hidden. For us as modern people, perhaps sometimes we're not aware of how subtle cultures need and thinkers need to be in order to keep those traditions alive.
Yes, indeed. Yeah. Was that a question, Joanna?
So, which is why it's so wonderful that you did this work, because as I believe you pointed out, these types of efforts to look at those hidden symbols in the building have not really been done before you, and the building is usually thought to be, is the word aniconic, I think is what's used to describe it. Can you just talk briefly about, I'm going to in the show notes, I'm going to include links to what I can find of some images that you will allow to be shared, a few of them, just so people can get an idea.
I'll send you a package of images if I
beautiful. I will throw some in. If you're watching the video version, you will at times see some images, and I'll make sure that there's places that people can see this, because sight is important to this, as well as an audio clip we'll talk about in a little bit. But yes, so for what they were encoding, it is considered aniconic by other peoples. Can you explain what that is and why you disagree?
Well, it's another of these 19th century kind of evolutionary concepts. Aniconic was coined to express the notion that people started out worshipping a lump of stone and then evolved towards figuration. This was the idea. Okay, so aniconic was the non-figurative primitive stage. Okay, now it's then kind of slipped loose of its evolutionary theory and become a kind of grabble for anything that isn't strictly figurative. And once you've labeled something as, well, it's not figurative, then it's, what is it? It's abstract, it's decorative. And that seems to have been the prevailing view about the marble revetment and flooring of the Hagia Sophia up till now. But that left huge questions unanswered. For instance, why had they engineered the veins in the marble floor to make it look like a great sea? And why had they placed 4 inlaid green bands asymmetrically across this space? You know, and like modern scholarship had said, well, it's anachronic. So, and then if you pay careful attention to the revetment, now there's 4 massive stone pillars on which this massive dome rests. And those stone pillars are encased in marble panels. Now, the process for the creation of these panels is far from random. We look at them today and they just look like marble with seams of lines through them. So we don't, and again, we have this label in the back of our mind. Well, it's anachronic, isn't it? But when you think about the process by which the panels are created, first of all, of course, they have to select blocks of marble. They have to square them and then ship them to Istanbul, to Constantinople, as it was then. They then have to slice them, having selected certain marble blocks. They slice them just as you'd slice a loaf of bread. And you polish the front of the first slice and the back of the second, front of the third and the back of the fourth slice, so on, right through the marble block. And placing the polished faces uppermost, you can then begin to match them to each other. And the seams that run through the marble block will now create symmetrical patterns depending on which panels you place adjacent to each other, how many, and how you turn them. So the paneling that's up in the building has a decorative element, and it's quite clear. It's in the middle section of like 3 major sections. And this is a 50-meter tall column we're talking about, divided into 3 bands. And when you look carefully at the first and the final band, it's clear that the marble revetment has been put together in such a way that arachnid-like forms appear. And this puzzled me for a long, long time until the penny dropped. That what we're looking at here is not anachronic, it's figurative, but it's done in a very subtle way. And unless you have a background in Hellenistic literary, metaphysical, and mythical tradition, you're not really going to spot it. So if you go in there with this, first of all, this anachronic label, and then the secondary, the presumption that you're dealing with a Christian edifice, you're really not going to be able to see what they're trying to tell you. The sea is described in Plato as the Hellenic underworld, okay? And it has 4 rivers. He names the rivers, and each of the rivers represents a purificatory regime for those who fall into the underworld. The presence of these like arachnid forms in the vertical paneling surrounding the central space relates to Orion and his killing by a scorpion as an act of retributive justice, so that the scorpion came to be a symbol of retributive justice, and therefore complements the notion of the purificatory rivers and of reading the sea as the watery underworld of Hellenic tradition. And this goes right back to Pindar. You can, I've got some examples in the book, can see how this tradition has evolved. So who decides and where is the decision taken about who is to be placed in the underworld for purification or forever? It happens in the meadow of judgment in traditional Hellenistic thought. And so when you get to the middle section of Hagia Sophia, all of a sudden the marble gives way to these involute floral forms in the capitals, and that becomes a greenish, like meadow-like mosaic background in which there are different colored flowers embedded. Okay, so this is where the emperor and empress would have sat during Mass. It's the meadow of judgment in terms of Hellenistic tradition. And I'm sure that the Hellenists who helped to run the court and would be standing behind them would be fully aware of what they were looking at when this Christian tyrant of an emperor.
Which direction was he going to go from that meadow? Yes.
Yeah, exactly. That would have been, So you can see the dissenting element is cleverly done, both in the sense of how it's at once it's explicit. I mean, it's in the open, and yet without the necessary background orientation, you'll never see it. So this is a remarkable part of it. This is the decorative design, at least as it covers the first two layers of the building.
And then, of course, we haven't even mentioned the Golden Dome, which is one of the most incredible parts of this building. And just to backtrack, what we're essentially saying is that I think what this is coming down to is that within the architecture and within the design of the building itself is sort of mapped out the journey of a soul, and therefore there is both the sea, as you were saying, the rivers, motif, yeah. And then there's also that golden light that comes from above, which for the Hellenists, coming from like the Platonic idea and the mystery school idea, would have been sort of like union, theurgy, with the divine, and what comes after. And I think that it's beautiful. In the book, there's a section where you talk about the importance of theurgy and this union with the divine being also about like discovering, how is it put, that you were a child of the gods, and that you then were sort of striving through your life to mold yourself and change yourself to become more similar to the deity, but then the deity was also pulling you towards that. So there's a sort of joining together. So in that sense, in walking through the building, that is also kind of like being joined by the building on that. And I feel like it's a beautiful, synthesis of of it as ritual tech to be walked through, that also is giving you the experience of potentially having the opportunity to join that golden light. Yes, or not.
Yeah. I mean, again, the light was an active element, as was the sound. Okay, so we need now to move from talking about the decorative design to the architectural design of the building itself. And basically, I can summarize it as saying it reprises the process of creation described in Plato's Timaeus, which is, Timaeus was apparently a Pythagorean, and most of Plato's dialogue called Timaeus is just Timaeus talking about how creation unfolds according to proportion and harmony in the Pythagorean worldview. And what they appear to have done, the two designers, is simply replicate that creation process. So the Timaeus has this it has a two-step creation process. The second one, though, hinges upon this entity without qualities called the Cora. And again, they talk about in relationship to gold, so that you have this golden dome. Now, the dome itself is not the original dome. The one that designers actually placed there was almost flat. And that's an incredibly risky thing to do because it means most of the weight is dispersed laterally rather than vertically. And the pillars are there to take the vertical weight. But when you make a dome very shallow, it tends to push the pillars apart. So they actually opted for a suboptimal design, if that makes any sense. They could have made a safe dome by making it as high-pitched as possible. Instead of that, they went for almost a flat one. And they covered it in gold tesserae, which means they actually covered a sheet of glass with gold foil and baked it, and then cut it up into small 1 centimeter square pieces and placed each one individually into the ceiling. So they were all angled as a reflector, a gold reflector. And then they had the sills that let light into the dome areas were lined with a silver tesserae. So they would be pure mirror, reflecting the external light up onto this shallow mirror-like dome. And that would infuse the apes, the nous in Greek, with a golden light. So when we talk about the infusion of the spiritual with the architecture, the sound and the light, these were all intrinsic to the design, so that it reprised the process of creation, top down. Bottom up, it reprised the Hellenic afterlife. And the afterlife theme is especially important in relationship to theurgy, because in theurgy, as in death, you exit through Capricorn in the winter solstice. And again, we've talked about this in relation to Mistai probably, and also in the game of Saturn it came up. So I was astounded to see that the southernmost pier, the southernmost face of that southernmost pier had matching marble panels that looked like Capricorn. Okay, and right next to them on the other side of the pillar were embedded plaques with the insignia of Poseidon. And it absolutely astounded me that nobody in all the literature about this building has talked about how the insignia of Poseidon could possibly be embedded in its structure when there is no Christian embedded imagery whatsoever before like the 9th or 10th century. So it's that kind of lacuna, you know, it just didn't make sense to scholars, I think. Although, I mean, people are going around, thousands of people every day and viewing these things and taking photographs. It's not like they're hidden away or something. But putting them together and understanding the underlying narrative is the key element. And once you understand that in Proclus, for instance, Poseidon is the guide of souls, Capricorn in the southern solstice is the gateway by which souls leave in theurgy as in death, then you all of a sudden can put it together and understand that the designers have also embedded a kind of tribute to the practice of theurgy within the architecture of the building, which is another astounding fact.
Yeah, and I think that that's both of those factors, the fact that that's not been commented on before, the iconography of Poseidon, and the fact that for that early period there was no Christian imagery whatsoever within the building is really interesting to think on, especially since the surfaces, this is, I feel, I was thinking about this when I was reading that and imagining how they could have gotten that across to Justinian as a good idea. And the only thing I could think on was that they must have sold it as for an acoustic reason, because of course the more things you add to a building, to surfaces, the less reflectivity, like it changes the harmonics of the sound quite a bit. So if I had been the designers, I probably would have gone with that angle, and that does kind of start to bring us into the sound of the space.
I think they could have also have sold it on the basis of the fact that he wanted it as a unifying image to kind of stamp his imprimatur on the empire. So just as he was busily attempting to reestablish the ancient borders of the Roman Empire, he wanted marbles from every corner of the empire to be represented in the building's fabric. You know, so they certainly have achieved that.
Yes.
You know, that would be but as you say, it's probably in the area of acoustics that they had the best chance to sell this concept. And I just want to underline how extraordinary this aesthetic design is in the context of Byzantine art and architecture, because you can compare this building with those in Ravenna, which were built almost immediately after Hagia Sophia, and therefore almost certainly employed the same craftspeople. Okay, and if you look at the Byzantine, Ravenna was the Byzantine capital in Italy, basically. And if you look at any of the Byzantine architecture there, the interior design is literally covered from floor to ceiling in Christian imagery. It's absolutely, you know, top to bottom So to have such a unique aesthetic concept just in Constantinople, I couldn't find it elsewhere. I mean, on a simple level, for instance, there's revetment in Ravenna, but there they've used like 4 panels, and then they've placed it so that the veins running through the marble make these beautiful harmonious Rosetta shapes. And I see those again in the Kora, for instance, in Istanbul, which is from 12th, 13th century. So there's a tradition of dealing with revetment to create harmonious shapes and pleasing colors. And what we have again is this distinct aesthetic in Hagia Sophia, these arachnid-like forms in the most disturbing shades of bluey green gray. You know, it's like a subterranean experience. So yes, that brings us to the acoustic design. Yes.
Since I am a professional musician, my husband is as well as an audio engineer. Of course, we immediately had to go, and I will be linking in the show notes to the Icons of Sound recordings that have been made using technology to sort of recreate the effect of performing and listening to a performance within the acoustic world of that building. And it is quite unique in terms of the length of its reverberations. Is it between 12 and 15 seconds? I can't remember. I didn't put it in my notes.
12 to 14 seconds. Yeah, absolutely.
It's absolutely incredible. And can you just talk a little bit about how do you see that as playing into the story, the Hellenistic worldview, and also kind of the stories that are being told with the building itself?
Okay, so when modern musicologists describe Byzantine chant, for instance, they talk about the nonsense syllables, which are a fundamental part of it. Okay. But of course, for us, they're not nonsense syllables at all. They are what is called the voces magica in the Greco papyrus tradition of magical invocation or evocation, strings of vowels that are sung in a certain way. And there's a way of even singing the same vowel, but changing the note, the intonation on it. And it's that's at the heart of Byzantine chant. So for the musicologists, nonsense syllables are actually in the past evocation or invocation of specific spirits and deities. So given the confusing or the cascading, let's say, sound environment, the acoustic design as a cascading instrument, it's perfectly suited to these resonant types of soundings. I don't say words, they're soundings. They're playing upon a string of vowels with variations. And the variations are designed to create a certain vibration within the energy body. That's, as we all know, that's the key to doing ritual properly, to vibrate the sound and by listening to the icons of sound, especially the bass running on these vowel sounds, you can feel the vibrationary effect of it, especially in the lower chakras, which it tends to energize. And then the higher vocal registers, there may be words in there, but they're almost impossible to make them out. So the melodies were based on the temple melodies of the previous Hellenistic temples. They didn't need to change the melodies. They added words because it was now Christian hymns that were being sung, but the basic technology hadn't really changed from the temples of ancient Greece and Egypt, actually. Some of the earliest examples are talked about in an Egyptian context, how the sounding of the vowels was an integral part of the rite of invocation, for instance, of the great deities. So that's the kind of territory we're in with this. And that makes sense to me. The reverb is an instrumentalization of the voice as an invocatory mechanism. I don't know if you agree with that.
Oh, I couldn't agree more. And I think it speaks to the we're talking about the impacts of a building, which is a physical space,
Yeah,
which has, architecture, it has iconography, it has things of that nature. But then it also, and so there's the play of the light, and then there's also the play of the sound, which to some degree you can describe as you do beautifully in the book. But sound, just like light, is also physical, and sound acts upon the body
yeah,
in physical ways. And therefore,
absolutely.
the way that a space is designed and the way that it then has the sound waves actually enter the body, because they are
Yeah,
physical, having physical effects on the body, is something that can be ignored or forgotten, I think, also in our modern world, especially because we are used to hearing sound like music through our phones or through electronic sources. And it's not the same experience as being in a space that then constitutes, like, changes the reverberation, that actually changes the effect that it can have on the body, because the
yeah,
waves of the sound are actually hitting the body at different rates based on that reverberation. And considering how advanced the Pythagoreans and the Hellenists were in their knowledge
mm,
of math and geometry and
yeah,
sound waves, I'm sure they were very aware of, more than we are, of what the impacts of having those cycles happening over 12 seconds, the kind of looping
yeah,
effect you could have of those
yeah, yeah.
waves on a body that we
Two,
just
two,
can't
two
get.
points on that, Joanna. Is one is that when we look at the designers, we didn't really explore them, but one of them was a specialist in acoustics and light.
Mm.
That was his scientific research area.
So
And
then clearly.
the other one was a specialist in stereometry, three-dimensional geometries, and especially vaulting in terms of a practical engineering discipline. So the use of arches, domes, semi-domes as load-bearing structures, and you put these two skill sets together, and then add to that the the impetus to create something which captured their spiritual heritage, metaphysically, spiritually, experientially, we may say phenomenologically. What the space has, which most modern music lacks, is most modern music is far too precise. So it engages your conscious sense rather than the vibratory sub-intellectual level of the body itself. So when you have a reverberation of such duration, it's almost impossible to engage with it intellectually. I mean, there's not a melody flowing forward that you can follow, for instance. So intellectually, there's nothing to follow. There's an immersion in a cascading, echoing sound.
Yes.
Okay, so you're kind of swept by tides. And I think this is evident if the people listen to the icons of sound. It's like a tidal movement. So the sound kind of sweeps from a base through into upper registers and carries you energetically with it.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously this satisfied the needs of a Byzantine mass, just as it would satisfy the needs of a temple.
Yeah, exactly. That's
You
another
know,
example. Yeah, the examples of them encoding something that is, they could put into something that someone in the modern day could just call, oh, we don't know, they're meaningless syllables, where actually that was encoded, something that was a much older sort of ritual technology of
yes,
how you're impacting someone's experience of the world, their experience of the divine.
yes,
And you're doing it in such a subtle way that you can have it take place in a church that maybe run by a tyrant at the time, but still can have those same physical impacts, those same spiritual impacts on someone through that technology, whether
yeah.
it's
So
light
you
or
can
images
kind
of
of
sound.
override
Yeah.
or ride on top of
Mm-hmm.
what is on the surface happening.
Yeah.
Underneath, there's something else going on.
And I think that
Design and light and sound, yeah.
which also then touches upon something that I kind of wanted to come to, which is that the building changed a great deal over time, and now is not a place where music. This is not a place where, oh, I want to go and I'll hear a concert there, and then I will be able to experience it. No, no. Buildings change over time. The uses, change as this one has. I have some questions about kind of how modern spaces have taken over this role. But before I do that, I just realized I wanted to make one last point, which is that even amongst us as modern day performers, there is very much the understanding that various pieces of music, various types of emotions or things that you want to get across are very different in differing spaces, both technically, but also, from a spiritual and emotional perspective. The space really does change how we have to perform and the performative aspects of what we do as a technology. But with that being said, with the space changing, how much of the school that put together this building do you feel survived, and in what other ways do you think that it was encoded? What other places can we find that encoding outside of this?
I couldn't find it.
It is. I mean, it does seem insanely and amazingly unique to me.
Yeah. And just, when I compare its aesthetic design to all the other Byzantine architecture, this is of an order intellectually and spiritually, which I haven't. Perhaps the Pantheon in Rome definitely bears comparison with that. Although that is far simpler architecturally and in concept. Of course, it's a much earlier building, 2 centuries earlier or something. But if you go in the Pantheon in Rome, you get a sense of a similar spiritual technology at work. The use of marble and light especially in the Pantheon, has been very cleverly designed. Unfortunately, you do need to capture that space when it's not full of tourists to have a sense of it. It's tricky. I suspect you probably have to go to some of the subterranean Mithraea in Rome to have a similar experience. They certainly have a unique design, cave-like, and really quite subterranean. But again, these are not in the same league as the Hagia Sophia.
Yeah. With that being said, I feel like there's no one better that I could ask. I've heard other people posit that elements of the mystery traditions, for example, like the worship of Mithras in places like the Celtic Isles and other parts of what was the Roman Empire, kind of because they were practiced in other parts of the empire, when that empire kind of collapsed, do you feel that elements of those mystery cults could have or did survive in other parts of Europe? Have you seen any evidence of that you think is worth talking about? Or
it's something really needs digging into, and it's difficult because of the hold that Christianity had over judicial process, for instance. But there's one account of a Christian bishop performing a theurgic invocation in Constantinople of the ancient gods. And if you recall that Platon's closest admirer was a cardinal of the Roman Catholic Church, Bessarion. He had formerly been Orthodox in Constantinople, a metropolitan. And of course, as part of the 1438-39 attempt to join the churches, he actually became a cardinal in Rome, and under his kind of control was the so-called Platonic Academy, again they use this phrase, of Rome, but actually they were doing ritual in the underground spaces of Rome, in the catacombs. So there is definitely a merger or an infiltration of Christian churches, Orthodox and Catholic, by people who are essentially Hellenist in their outlook and belief. But you know, but we're getting onto ground now where we're almost in the edge of conspiracy, and
we start getting more into opinion than than anything
well,
else. Yeah.
there's a very famous opinion by a Jesuit who was the chief astronomer for the Jesuit order, Windswept House. It's a novel, but he attests that it opens with a ritual being conducted in the bowels of the Vatican, which paralleled a rite being enacted in the US. And it's essentially a act of theurgic invocation. He claims that there were groups within the cardinalate and the higher levels of the church who were fully conversant with these practices. So
Well,
people want to check the opening chapter of that novel. He said, yes, it's novel, kind of, Windswept House.
I'll put that in the show notes because I myself will be looking that up. So
they could be in for a shock.
Well, I would argue that the fact that we are having this conversation today and the fact that you have written this book is proof enough that something has come down to us from those periods and is upwelling again in people, as it always does. So
yeah. I mean, a lot of inspiring thoughts and ideas come from the fact that they were able to transpose the rites from a sacred landscape to an urban environment and have a developmental program towards Genesis. So it shows it can be done. And it just needs people who are dedicated enough to specific deities to make it work. The technology, so to speak, is proven.
Yeah, that lived experience of the practices of these things is very, very crucial and can be done again and is, still survives in some forms.
I wanted to mention one thing to you is Boethius's 3 books on the foundations of music. I don't know if you're aware. I don't know it. I think this is pretty well contemporary with the design of the Hagia Sophia. And what he did is collate ancient resources on the Pythagorean theory of music. So 3 books. First book is the harmony intrinsic to the universe. The second book is harmony intrinsic to the human soul. And the third book is harmony in relation to instrumentation. So instruments, musical instruments. And anyone in the music business who's interested in this stuff may want to check that out.
That does sound fascinating.
De Institutione Musica, but of course it's translated. There's modern translations.
Yes.
It's been translated forever. You can find, and also more obscure Pythagorean musical metaphysics is in Nicomachus of Gerasa. So, these are texts which I think non-musicians will find difficult because the principles of harmony are something to deal with. It's a thing.
It's a set of symbols, shall we say, that you have to practice. But I think that's also similar to math in that sense, where there is something different when you practice it as opposed to when you have when you work out the problems themselves. As we were saying much earlier, there's something about that which then, through the act of understanding the equations, of mapping them out and practicing that math as a practice, does actually, in some sense, connect you to the divine, which is why I feel like I have a friend of mine who's a mathematician who is always saying, like, you go far enough into math, you are a mystic. There's no argument there. And it's the same where music has that connection. You can understand it, sort of from outside of itself, but when you practice it, then that gives you a different understanding of it. And it's that working out of it and doing it that gives a different understanding. Both are important, though.
Boethius.
Boethius. And that also ties into that, there's music of the spheres, and we're not going to go there, but, there's so much about the harmonic series that has been found, like even in the background radiation of, that the Hubble telescope has found. Like there's elements to that harmony that the Greeks and the Egyptians and whoever else was saying this was absolutely right. Not that you and I would doubt that, but at the same time, it's always fun to see it popping up other places.
It is, yeah. The confirmation is interesting, yeah.
Mm-hmm. This is just so fantastic, and I can't recommend your book highly enough. And for anyone who's interested in architecture, in history, in philosophy, all of these different topics that you go into so beautifully, it is a wonderful work, and it is a pleasure to talk to you about it. Is there anything else that you want to kind of leave listeners with, about this work, or about another that you are working on?
Well, I think with all my writing, there's a certain difficulty involved, because it's not just a data dump. I try to write in a style which is invocatory, that brings you closer to the subject matter. So there's a lot of technical material in there in relationship to architecture, to the marbles and the preparations and so on. So if you're of a mind to absorb this material, it's there in an abundance of richness. So I hope it's the kind of book you can read and then come back to again. It's not like you just get a data dump from it. And we've tried to illustrate it with the best photography, for instance, that we could find. I got these superb black and white photographs from Dumbarton Oaks, which is Harvard's School of Byzantine Studies. They are very supportive. And I also got the original architectural drawings of Hagia Sophia, which were done in the 1950s, 60s, in situ. Finally, I commissioned an award-winning photographer to go in there with me and do so to speak, the evidentiary photography. So that wherever we talk about something in the text, I've tried to illustrate it with very fine photographic reproductions.
They are beautiful photographs.
As soon as I can reconnect to my laptop, which is giving up the ghost, I'll send you some.
Those will be included so that some people watching can see those as well.
What I'm working on now is going to be a book called The Cult of Saturn, and it kind of takes a fly through the Saturnian current as it's manifested itself in Hellenistic, Roman, Renaissance, and later culture. So we're looking at it more in terms of its metaphysics and its underlying relationships to issues of fate, destiny, providence, and so on. So that'll be published by Theon, which is a shift from Scarlet Imprint. And it's simply because they were overwhelmed with the amount of projects they have in hand, which will take them through all 2023 into 2024. So they just said to me, it's okay with us, you have our blessing, work with Theon for this one. I'm very happy to do so. Theon is very much in tune with the Saturnian current itself. So hopefully that'll be ready by this summer. So we may even see it this year. Beyond that, I'm planning to return to the practice of mystery initiation in Egypt. So we'll be going back to the pre-dynastic and old kingdoms and looking at the initiatory imagery and the portions of the Book of the Dead, for instance, that deal with the theurgic transmission of the soul to the afterlife and back. So,
how long do we have to wait for that one? No.
So I hope
I'm not going to rush you.
Plan to finish at the end of this year, but let's see how we go.
Yes, yes.
I'm
Very
hoping to make a trip to Karnak, but we'll see if that's especially the Temple of Amun bears visiting. And in a sense,
absolutely.
It's going back to the roots of the Saturnian current in its high temple frame, or so to speak, cultural and institutional frame.
Mm-hmm.
So, of course, the priesthood of Amun ran the country for centuries, especially during the periods when they have the so-called intermediate periods. The north was invaded and occupied, and the priesthood of Amun actually ran the state for many centuries. So it's phenomenally powerful, and especially in that context, the priestess of Amun was a fundamental and powerful figure, often recruited from the royal family. She was an incredibly powerful figure. We'll be looking at that as well. And the original ecstatic cult, I mean, a lot of people think of Isis when they think of Egyptian ancient religion. But in fact, Isis is kind of a Hellenistic figure. Before kind of the end of the Egyptian pharaohs and the start of the Hellenistic pharaohs. Okay, so this is the Ptolemies, who were essentially Macedonians masquerading as Egyptian pharaohs. Okay, they were really responsible for inaugurating the cult of Isis, because she didn't have that cult presence before then. The great goddess of Egypt was Hathor. And we always think of her as like a cow-like figure, but in fact she had an ecstatic cohort of priestesses whose bodies were kind of covered in tattoos. And we're going to explore this, as they were fundamental, I believe, to the initiatory process. And they're straight out of the borderland of Egypt and Africa. So we're looking at a body of initiatory priestesses who were kind of ecstatic and had control of fertility and childbirth, initiation rites. Mm-hmm. So we're going to a very primitive place in that respect, before layers of patriarchal societal control overlaid the kind of now
cult.
Yeah. Now that's what I'm hoping to explore towards the end of the year.
That sounds absolutely amazing, and will certainly be looking forward to that, as I'm sure all of my listeners will be looking forward to, and can't wait to have you back on the show for any of these works, or some other reason or excuse that we come up with. We'll cook something up.
Delighted to. Always delighted to talk to you.
All right. Well, thank you so much for this conversation today and for all of your work. And I'll talk to you again soon.
Yeah. Take care, Joanna.
Black moon above, stars overhead. Don't you dare guide me back to my bed. The river is frozen, the pollen path's bare. Don't wait for me, darling, there's thorns in my